The air in the grand ballroom of the Vance Tower was a finely tuned instrument, humming with the murmur of 100 conversations, the clink of crystal against crystal, and the distant, mournful cry of a lone saxophone. It was an atmosphere of manufactured ease, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and hothouse lilies. For Leo Miller, it was the sound of a cage. He stood near the service entrance, a ghost in a black uniform, his posture a study in professional invisibility. His job was simple: to exist at the periphery, to anticipate a need before it was spoken, to be a seamless part of the gilded machine. His hands, though steady as he polished an already gleaming champagne flute, felt chapped and raw. He could feel the phantom weight of his daughter's latest creation on his wrist, a small, lopsided bracelet woven from rainbow-colored yarn. He had taken it off before his shift, tucking it carefully into the worn inner pocket of his coat, a secret talisman against the oppressive opulence of the evening. Lily's world was one of frayed edges and vibrant, messy colors. This world, Julian Vance's world, was all sharp lines and monochrome perfection. Leo's gaze drifted across the sea of tailored suits and shimmering gowns, landing for a moment on the man himself. Julian Vance stood at the center of the room, not because he sought the spotlight, but because the spotlight was drawn to him as if by gravitational law. He was the CEO, the architect of this empire of steel and glass, and he wore his power not like a crown, but like a perfectly cut suit, an undeniable part of his form, tailored so precisely it appeared effortless. He was talking to a senator, his expression controlled, a slight, practiced smile on his lips that never quite reached his eyes. Leo had seen those eyes before, in passing, during other events. They were the color of a winter storm, intelligent and cool, and held a profound, almost startling weariness that seemed at odds with the man who commanded entire industries. A familiar dread began to coil in Leo's stomach. It was getting late. Mrs. Petrova, his elderly neighbor who watched Lily, would be getting tired. He imagined his daughter curled up on their lumpy sofa, her small face illuminated by the flickering blue light of a cartoon, her breathing soft and even. The thought was a small, warm stone in the cold river of his anxiety. He needed this job. He needed the overtime. The rent was due, and Lily's worn-out sneakers were a constant, silent accusation in the corner of their tiny entryway. He was so lost in the calculus of survival that he didn't see the shadow detach itself from the crowd until it was almost upon him. The scent of stale cologne and cheap whiskey cut through the refined air, a discordant note in the ballroom symphony. "Leo, fancy seeing you here." The voice was a rusty key scraping in a lock he had tried so hard to change. Leo's spine went rigid. He didn't have to turn to know who it was. Mark. His past, walking and breathing and reeking of entitlement. He turned slowly, keeping his expression neutral, a mask he had perfected over years of practice. "Mark, you shouldn't be here. This is a private event." Mark's smile was thin and unpleasant. He was dressed in a suit that was trying too hard, the fabric a little too shiny under the recessed lighting. He looked out of place, a weed in a meticulously cultivated garden. "I have my ways. You're looking tired, Leo. All this work for pennies. It's not a good look." He let his eyes roam over Leo's uniform with a dismissive sneer. "What do you want?" Leo's voice was a low murmur, his body angled to shield the conversation from the rest of the room. Panic was a frantic bird beating against his ribs. To be seen with Mark here could cost him his job. "What I'm owed," Mark said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "You know the deal. I'm in a bit of a tight spot. A couple hundred would see me right." "I don't have it." It was the simple, desperate truth. Every dollar he earned was already accounted for, stretched thin to cover the barest of necessities. Mark's eyes hardened. He took a step closer, invading Leo's personal space, his voice rising just enough to be a threat. Don't lie to me. You're working in a place like this, surrounded by all this money. Don't tell me you can't skim a little off the top. Or are you going to make me ask your bosses? Maybe tell them a few stories about your past. I'm sure they'd be very interested. The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Leo's breath caught in his throat. He felt the eyes of the room on him, the carefully constructed walls of his invisibility crumbling around him. He was exposed, vulnerable, and a cold sweat trickled down his back. From across the room, Julian Vance had noticed the shift in the room's energy. It was a subtle thing, a disturbance in the force field of polite society. His gaze, sharp and analytical, swept the floor and snagged on the tense tableau near the service entrance. He saw one of his catering staff, a man he vaguely recognized from other functions, quiet, efficient, with a face that held a deep, settled sadness, cornered by a man who radiated a predatory instability. He saw the caterer's pale face, the rigid line of his shoulders, the sheer panic in his eyes. Julian's conversation with the senator faded into white noise. An unfamiliar instinct, sharp and fiercely protective, cut through the fog of corporate pleasantries. He excused himself with a curt nod, his movements fluid and decisive as he crossed the room. He didn't know the man's name, but he knew injustice when he saw it. He arrived at Leo's side just as Mark reached out to grab Leo's arm. Julian's voice was quiet, yet it carried the weight of absolute authority. It was a voice accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Is there a problem here?" Mark froze, his hand hovering in the air. He turned, his bravado faltering as he took in the imposing figure of Julian Vance. Recognition dawned, followed by a flicker of fear. Leo looked up, startled, his eyes meeting Julian's. For a split second, he saw something other than the cold, distant CEO. He saw a flicker of concern, a focused intensity that was directed entirely at him. "No problem, Mr. Vance," Mark stammered, trying to recover. "Just catching up with an old friend." Julian's gaze remained fixed on Leo, a silent question in his storm-gray eyes. Leo gave the slightest shake of his head, a minute gesture of desperation. It was all the confirmation Julian needed. Julian moved with an almost imperceptible smoothness, placing himself slightly between the two men. He rested a hand lightly on the small of Leo's back. The touch was a shock, a point of solid, grounding warmth against the thin fabric of his uniform. It was firm, proprietary, and utterly astonishing. "I think my husband and I would like to be left alone now," Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate timbre that was clearly meant to be overheard. He looked directly at Mark, his eyes cold and dismissive. "If you have business here, I suggest you conduct it with someone else. If you don't, security will be happy to show you the way out." The word hung in the air between them. Husband. Leo's mind went completely blank. The bird in his chest stopped its frantic beating and simply fell from its perch. Mark's jaw went slack, his face a comical mask of disbelief and confusion. He looked from Julian's implacable expression to Leo's stunned silence. The power dynamic had shifted so completely, so irrevocably, that he was left floundering. Mark sputtered, before wilting completely under Julian's glacial stare. Without another word, he turned and practically fled, melting back into the crowd and making for the exit. The space he left behind was filled with a ringing silence. The hand on Leo's back remained, a steady, reassuring pressure. The low hum of the party returned to Leo's ears, but it sounded distant now, muffled, as if he were listening from underwater. "Are you all right?" Julian's voice was different now, stripped of the public performance. It was quiet, laced with genuine concern. Leo could only nod, his throat too tight for words. He felt a tremor run through him, the delayed shock of the confrontation. "Come with me," Julian said. It was not a request. He guided Leo away from the service entrance, through a discreet door Leo had never noticed before, and into a silent, dimly lit corridor. The sudden quiet was a balm. Away from the prying eyes of the gala, the air shifted. The pretense fell away, leaving a raw, uncertain space between them. Julian removed his hand from Leo's back, and the loss of the contact was felt more keenly than its arrival. He stood a respectful distance away, his hands in his pockets, his formidable presence softened by the dim lighting. "I apologize if I overstepped," Julian began, his tone formal yet not unkind. "It seemed like the most efficient way to de-escalate the situation. I saw you were in distress." Leo finally found his voice, though it was rough. "Thank you. You didn't have to do that." "He was harassing you." It was a simple statement of fact. "No one on my staff should be subjected to that." My staff. The words brought Leo back to reality with a jolt. He was an employee. This man was his boss's boss's boss. The chasm between their worlds was vast and uncrossable. The brief, shocking illusion of intimacy in the ballroom dissolved into professional courtesy. "Still," Leo said, rubbing his arms as if to ward off a chill. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. You probably saved my job." "Julian," he corrected gently. "And you don't need to thank me." He studied Leo's face, the lingering fear in his eyes, the faint tremor in his hands. "That man. Is he likely to bother you again?" Leo thought of Mark's vindictive nature, his inability to let things go. "Probably." The admission was a weight in his gut. Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Let me give you a ride home. It's the least I can do. I don't want you going home alone tonight." Leo's first instinct was to refuse, to shrink back into the safety of his anonymity. But the thought of waiting for the late-night bus, of looking over his shoulder at every shadow, was exhausting. And there was something in Julian's steady gaze that felt safe. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in a very long time. "Okay," he heard himself say. "Thank you." The ride in Julian's car was a surreal experience. The vehicle itself was less a car and more a silent, gliding capsule of black leather and polished wood. It smelled faintly of old books and clean, cold air. The city lights slid past the tinted windows, a blur of fractured color in the rain-slicked streets. The steady, rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers was the only sound. Leo sat stiffly in the passenger seat, hyper-aware of the man beside him. Julian drove with an easy, focused competence, his large hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. The silence wasn't awkward, but it was heavy with unspoken things. "I live in the Embankment District," Leo said quietly, breaking the spell. "It's not on your way, I'm sure." "It is tonight," Julian replied, without taking his eyes off the road. Leo given the address, feeling a flush of shame at the thought of this magnificent car pulling up to his run-down apartment building. He directed him to the corner, not wanting him to see the cracked pavement and the graffiti on the brick wall. "Here is fine," he said, his hand already on the door handle. Julian pulled the car to a smooth stop, but made no move to unlock the doors. He turned in his seat, the faint glow of the dashboard illuminating the sharp planes of his face. "Leo, if he is a genuine threat to you, I have resources. Security, legal counsel. You only have to ask." The offer was so far beyond the realm of Leo's reality that he couldn't immediately process it. People like Julian Vance didn't solve problems for people like him. It was a transaction. What would he want in return? But looking into those serious, gray eyes, he saw no calculation, only a quiet resolve. "Why?" Leo asked, the word escaping before he could stop it. "Why would you do that?" Julian was silent for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. "Because," he said finally, his voice low and soft. "For a moment back there, when I saw him threatening you, the thought of anyone hurting you felt unacceptable. The simple, stark honesty of the statement knocked the air out of Leo's lungs. He felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. He managed a small, grateful nod. "Thank you, Julian. I have to go. My daughter is waiting." At the mention of his daughter, something in Julian's expression softened. He unlocked the doors. "Of course." As Leo stepped out into the damp night air, a small voice called out from the doorway of his building. "Daddy!" Lily stood there, a tiny silhouette in dinosaur pajamas, her face pressed against the glass of the main door. Mrs. Petrova stood behind her, looking flustered. The sitter must have let her wait up. Leo's heart clenched. He rushed to the door, fumbling for his keys. "Sweetheart, you should be in bed." "I wanted to wait for you," she said, her voice muffled by the glass. He unlocked the door, and she launched herself into his arms, wrapping her small limbs around him in a fierce hug. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the familiar, comforting scent of strawberry shampoo and sleep. For a moment, he forgot everything else. When he looked up, Julian was standing on the sidewalk by his car, watching them. He hadn't driven away. He was just watching. There was an unreadable expression on his face, a mixture of curiosity and something that looked almost like longing. Lily, noticing the tall stranger, peeked over Leo's shoulder. She wasn't shy. She pointed a small finger. "Who's that, Daddy?" Before Leo could formulate a response, Julian walked towards them, stopping a few feet away. He crouched down slightly, bringing himself closer to Lily's eye level. It was a gesture of such unexpected gentleness that it made Leo's breath catch. "Hello," Julian said, his voice softer than Leo had ever heard it. "My name is Julian." Lily considered him with the grave seriousness of a 6-year-old. "You have a sad face," she announced with brutal honesty. A faint, genuine smile touched Julian's lips, reaching his eyes for the first time that night. It transformed his entire face, chasing away the shadows of weariness. "Do I?" "Yeah," Lily said, nodding sagely. "But it's okay. Daddy makes me a happy face with pancakes when I'm sad." She looked up at Leo. "Can he have pancakes?" Leo felt a blush creep up his neck. "Lily, honey, it's late. Mr. Julian has to go." "But his face is sad," she insisted, as if this were the most logical argument in the world. Julian chuckled, a low, pleasant sound. "Pancakes sound wonderful, but your father is right, it's very late." He looked from Lily to Leo, his gaze lingering. "It was a pleasure to meet you, Lily. You have a very good father." He straightened up, gave Leo a final, meaningful look, and walked back to his car. A moment later, the silent engine came to life, and the car disappeared into the night. Leo stood there on the damp pavement, holding his daughter, watching the taillights fade. The world felt tilted on its axis. The warmth of Julian's hand on his back, the shocking intimacy of the word husband, the quiet offer of protection, the gentle smile he had given Lily. It was all too much. He was safe. For tonight, at least. But as he carried Lily upstairs to their small, cramped apartment, a new kind of fear took root. It wasn't the familiar, sharp-edged fear of Mark. It was the terrifying, hopeful, and utterly bewildering fear of what Julian Vance's protection might actually mean. The next 2 days passed in a haze of normalcy that felt anything but normal. Leo went to work, his head down, avoiding eye contact, expecting at any moment to be called into his manager's office and fired. But nothing happened. The incident at the gala seemed to have vanished, swallowed by the building's silent, corporate efficiency. Yet the memory of it hummed under his skin, a constant, low-grade vibration. The real trouble began on the 3rd day. It started with a text message from an unknown number. A photo of Lily, taken from a distance, playing in the small, fenced-in park near their apartment building. The picture was grainy, clearly taken with a cheap phone, but the image was unmistakable. Lily on the swings, her head thrown back in a laugh. Underneath the photo, a single line of text. She looks so happy. It would be a shame if something happened to her. Leo's blood ran cold. He felt the floor drop out from under him. It was Mark. It had to be. This was his style. Cruel, indirect, targeting the one thing in the world Leo could not bear to lose. He sank onto his sofa, his phone clattering from his numb fingers. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. This was a line that had never been crossed before. His immediate instinct was to call the police, but he hesitated. What could he prove? Mark would deny it. He'd say it was a misunderstanding. The police had been useless before, treating his past complaints as a domestic squabble, a messy breakup they had no interest in untangling. They would see a single, vaguely threatening text and tell him to block the number. He felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. Then he remembered Julian's offer. I have resources. You only have to ask. The words echoed in his mind, a lifeline in a churning sea of panic. But the thought of calling him, of admitting this new, horrifying level of vulnerability, felt like a monumental failure. It was an admission that he couldn't protect his own daughter. He looked around the small apartment, at the crayon drawings taped to the walls, at Lily's worn teddy bear sitting on a chair. This was their sanctuary, and it had been violated. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. His hands shook as he found the business card Julian had discreetly tucked into his coat pocket before he had left the car. It was simple, elegant, just a name and a number on heavy, cream-colored cardstock. He dialed the number before he could lose his nerve. It rang only once. Vance? The voice was crisp, professional. But Leo heard the slight intake of breath when he identified himself. Julian, it's Leo Miller, from the other night. Leo. Julian's voice warmed instantly, losing its corporate edge. Is everything all right? The dam of Leo's composure broke. The words came out in a torrent, a jumbled mess of fear and explanation about the photo, the text, his terror for Lily. He was barely coherent, but Julian listened patiently, the silence on the other end of the line a solid, reassuring presence. When Leo finally ran out of breath, his voice choked with a sob, Julian spoke. His tone was calm, but beneath it lay a current of cold, controlled fury. Stay where you are. Lock your doors. I'm sending a car for you. It will be there in 15 minutes. Pack a bag for you and Lily. Just the essentials for a few days. The driver's name is Arthur. He will not leave your side until you are with me. Do you understand? A car? Where are we going? Leo asked, bewildered. You're coming to my place, Julian said, his voice leaving no room for argument. You and Lily will stay with me until this is handled. You will be safe there. The sheer, unquestioning certainty in his voice was overwhelming. Leo, who had spent years making every decision alone, was suddenly adrift in the current of someone else's absolute competence. He had no strength left to fight it. Okay, he whispered, true to his word. A sleek, black town car, identical to the one from the other night, pulled up in front of his building exactly 15 minutes later. A man with graying hair and a kind face, Arthur, met him at the door and carried their hastily packed bag as if it weighed nothing. He helped a sleepy and confused Lily into her car seat with a practiced ease that suggested he had children or grandchildren of his own. The ride uptown was a silent, dreamlike journey from one reality to another. They left the gritty, familiar streets of his neighborhood and entered a world of clean, wide avenues and towering glass buildings. Julian's building was a needle of dark glass that pierced the sky, its entrance manned by a team of discreet but imposing security guards. They bypassed the main lobby, driving into a private underground garage that led to a private elevator. The elevator opened directly into Julian's apartment, and Leo understood immediately why Julian had called it a safe place. It was a penthouse. A sprawling two-story expanse of glass and steel and minimalist furniture that seemed to float in the sky. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire space, offering a breathtaking, godlike view of the city lights spread out like a carpet of fallen stars. The place was vast, silent, and impeccably clean. It was less a home and more a beautiful, sterile fortress. Julian was waiting for them as the elevator doors whispered open. He was no longer in his suit. He wore a simple gray sweater and dark trousers, and the change made him seem younger, more approachable. He stepped forward as Leo guided a drowsy Lily out of the elevator. "Welcome," he said softly. He knelt down again to speak to Lily, his voice a low murmur. "Hello again, Lily. I don't have any pancakes, but I do have a room with a bed that looks like a giant, fluffy cloud. Would you like to see it?" Lily, rubbing her eyes, gave a sleepy nod. Julian led them down a long hallway to a guest suite that was larger than Leo's entire apartment. The bed was enormous, piled high with soft white pillows and a duvet that looked impossibly soft. Julian tucked her in with an unexpected tenderness, pulling the covers up to her chin. "You'll be safe here," he whispered to her. A promise meant as much for Leo as for his daughter. When they returned to the living area, the city lights twinkled below them in the deepening twilight. The sheer scale of the place was intimidating. It was beautiful, but it was empty. There were no photographs on the walls, no cluttered bookshelves, no sign of a life lived messily within its perfect lines. "Thank you for this," Leo said, his voice feeling small in the cavernous space. "It's more than I could have imagined." "It's the least I can do," Julian replied, his gaze intense. He gestured to one of the stark white sofas. "Please, sit. I've made some tea." Leo sat on the edge of the cushion, feeling like a museum visitor afraid to touch the exhibits. Julian handed him a cup of tea. Their fingers brushed, and a jolt of warmth shot up Leo's arm. It was the first moment of non-essential physical contact between them, a small, accidental intimacy that felt deafeningly loud in the quiet room. "My security team is already working on it," Julian said, taking a seat in an armchair opposite him. "They're tracking the number the text came from. They're also reviewing security footage from the park near your apartment. We will find him, Leo. And when we do, we will make sure he can never bother you or your daughter again." The quiet, lethal promise in his voice sent a shiver down Leo's spine. He had never had anyone fight for him before. The feeling was so foreign, so overwhelming, that he didn't know how to respond. "Why are you doing all this?" Leo asked again, the question more urgent this time. Julian looked out at the city, at the endless grid of lights and lives he commanded from his tower. "I told you, the thought of you being hurt is unacceptable." He turned his gaze back to Leo, and the vulnerability in his eyes was startling. "And perhaps this place is very large and very empty. It's been a long time since I've had anyone to protect." It was a confession, cloaked in the language of power, but a confession nonetheless. A confession of loneliness. In that moment, Leo saw past the CEO, past the wealth and the authority, and saw a man as isolated in his fortress in the sky as Leo had been in his world of fear and survival. The forced proximity of the next few days was a strange dance of awkwardness and burgeoning intimacy. Julian insisted on giving Leo and Lily the main guest suite, while he took a smaller room down the hall. Their lives, once separated by an unbridgeable social and economic gulf, were now intertwined in the most domestic of ways. Leo woke the first morning to the smell of coffee. He found Julian in the vast, stainless steel kitchen, looking slightly out of his element as he tried to work a complicated espresso machine. He was already dressed for work, his suit immaculate, but his hair was slightly damp from a shower. "Good morning," Julian said, a hint of frustration in his voice as the machine hissed rebelliously. "I'm not usually the one who operates this." "Let me," Leo offered, stepping forward. He had worked as a barista for a year in college, and his hands moved with familiar ease, tamping the coffee, locking the portafilter, coaxing a perfect stream of dark liquid into a cup. Julian watched him, a small, curious smile on his face. "You're full of surprises, Leo Miller." "You have to be, when you're on your own," Leo replied, handing him the cup. Their morning routine quickly fell into a pattern. Leo would make the coffee. Julian, who apparently had a private chef on call but rarely used him, would have fresh groceries delivered. They would make breakfast together for Lily, a quiet, three-person island in the middle of the enormous kitchen. Lily, with the unshakable resilience of a child, adapted to her new, luxurious surroundings with ease. She christened the apartment the Giant's Castle, and appointed Julian the sad giant who needed cheering up. She would leave her colorful drawings on his desk in his home office, bright splotches of crayon on his otherwise pristine mahogany surface. One afternoon, Leo found Julian staring at one of her creations, a wobbly portrait of the three of them holding hands under a smiling sun. Julian was touching the figure that was supposed to be him, a faint, wistful expression on his face. He didn't notice Leo standing in the doorway. It was a private moment, a glimpse into the cracks in his carefully constructed armor. The external threat, however, had not disappeared. Julian's head of security, a serious man named Graves, provided daily updates. Mark was proving slippery. He was using burner phones and staying off the grid, but they were closing in. The pressure mounted, a low thrum of anxiety beneath the surface of their strange domestic peace. The consequences of their initial public encounter also began to ripple outward. A gossip columnist with a popular online blog published a blurry photo of Julian with his arm around Leo at the gala. The headline was speculative and snide. "Billionaire CEO Julian Vance's mystery man. New love or a well-kept secret?" Julian showed it to Leo with a grim expression. "I'm sorry about this. My PR team is trying to get it taken down, but once it's out there..." He trailed off. Leo's heart sank. He was bringing scandal to this man's door. "I'm so sorry, Julian. This is my fault. All of this." "Don't," Julian said, his voice sharp but not angry. "This is not your fault. It is his." He looked at the article on his tablet again, his expression hardening. "In fact, we may be able to use this." A few days later, Julian had to attend a major charity auction, an event he sponsored annually. It was a high-profile, press-heavy affair. He was expected to be there. "I want you to come with me," he said to Leo that evening, his tone carefully neutral. Leo stared at him. "What? No, I can't. After that article, people will be watching." "That's the point," Julian said, his gaze steady. "Mark is trying to isolate you, to make you afraid. The best way to fight a man like that is to show him he has no power over you. We need to present a united front, to show the world and him that you are not alone, that you are with me." It was a terrifying proposition. To step willingly into the spotlight, to perform a relationship for the cameras, felt dishonest and frightening. "It will be a performance," Julian continued, sensing his hesitation. "We will attend, we will smile for the cameras, and we will leave. Arthur and 2 other security members will be with us the entire time. You will be perfectly safe." Leo looked at him, at the quiet confidence in his eyes, and found himself nodding. He was trusting this man with his daughter's safety. He could trust him with his own. The night of the auction was another descent into a world that felt alien to Leo. Julian had a suit delivered for him, a deep charcoal gray that fit him perfectly. When he emerged from his room, Julian was waiting in the living area, looking impossibly handsome in a classic black tuxedo. He stopped short when he saw Leo, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly. "You look," Julian started, then seemed to think better of it. "The suit fits well." "Thank you," Leo murmured, feeling a warmth spread through his cheeks. At the event, the moment they stepped out of the car, they were engulfed in a supernova of flashing cameras. The reporters shouted questions, their voices a chaotic chorus. Julian's hand immediately found the small of Leo's back, just as it had at the gala. The touch was grounding, a solid anchor in the storm of light and sound. "Just stay close," Julian murmured in his ear, his voice a low vibration against Leo's skin. "Smile and ignore them." Leo did as he was told, forcing a smile onto his face that felt brittle and fake. But as they moved through the crowd, something shifted. Julian didn't just stand beside him, he included him. He introduced him to his colleagues with a simple, "This is Leo," his tone leaving no room for questions. He kept a proprietary arm around him, his thumb occasionally stroking Leo's back, in a gesture that felt less like a performance and more like a genuine, unconscious comfort. Halfway through the evening, standing near a large window overlooking the city, Leo began to feel the pretense melt away. The way Julian looked at him when he thought no one was watching. The way he leaned in to whisper a dry, witty comment about one of the other guests. The way his hand never left him. It all felt startlingly real. "Are you doing okay?" Julian asked, his voice low. "I think so," Leo admitted. "It's just a lot." "I know." Julian's gaze softened. "But you're doing perfectly. You look like you belong here more than I do." Leo laughed, a real, genuine laugh. "I highly doubt that." "I'm serious," Julian said, his expression turning grave. "I've been coming to these events my entire adult life. I know how to navigate them. But I've never once felt like I belonged. It's all a performance." He looked at Leo, his gray eyes searching. "Tonight, with you, it feels different. Less like a performance." The admission hung between them, as bright and fragile as the crystal chandeliers overhead. Before Leo could respond, Julian's head of security, Graves, appeared at his elbow, his expression grim. "Sir, we have a problem." The breaking point came not with a bang, but with a quiet, terrifying phone call. Graves explained in a low, urgent tone that Mark, having seen the press photos from the auction, had become unhinged. He had managed to bypass the security on Julian's building phone lines and had called the penthouse directly. Lily's babysitter, a trusted woman from Julian's own staff, had answered. He hadn't threatened anyone. He had simply said, "I know she's alone up there." The blood drained from Leo's face. The noise of the party faded to a dull roar in his ears. Lily. He had left Lily. He had trusted she was safe, and in his absence the monster had found a way to whisper through the cracks of their fortress. They left the auction immediately, the ride back to the penthouse a blur of silent, suffocating terror. Leo sat rigid in the back seat, his hands clenched into fists in his lap, his mind replaying the words over and over again. "I know she's alone up there." Julian was on the phone the entire way, his voice a low, clipped instrument of command. He was mobilizing his entire security force, talking to the police commissioner directly, arranging for a patrol car to sit outside the building indefinitely. He was a general, marshalling his troops for war. When the private elevator opened into the apartment, Leo burst out, his heart pounding against his ribs. The babysitter met them at the door, her face pale but calm. Lily was fast asleep in her bed, blissfully unaware of the storm raging around her. Leo stood over her bed for a long time, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest, his whole body shaking with a mixture of relief and fury. He had brought this danger into her life. His past was a poison that was now threatening to infect her future. When he finally emerged from her room, He found Julian standing by the great wall of windows, staring out at the uncaring city below. The apartment was silent, except for the faint hum of the air circulation. "She's okay," Leo said, his voice hoarse. "She's sleeping." Julian turned, his face etched with a tension that seemed to go bone deep. "They'll find him, Leo. I swear to you. They will find him. Tonight." But Leo wasn't listening. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a cold, heavy exhaustion and a well of despair. "This has to stop," he said, his voice cracking. "I can't do this. I can't put her through this. I can't put you through this." He started pacing, his movements agitated. "I should never have come here. I should have run, taken Lily and gone somewhere he could never find us. But I was weak, and I was scared. And now I've dragged you into this mess, and your name is all over the news, and my daughter isn't safe even in a place like this." His voice rose, raw with anguish and self-loathing. "What was I thinking? That a man like you could actually... that we could actually... It was a fantasy. A stupid, dangerous fantasy. We should leave. In the morning, we'll leave." "No." The word was quiet, but it cut through Leo's frantic tirade like a shard of glass. Julian crossed the room in 2 long strides, stopping directly in front of him. He reached out and gripped Leo's upper arms, his hold firm but not harsh, forcing him to be still. "You are not leaving," Julian said, his voice low and intense. "You are not weak. You are the strongest person I have ever met. You have been surviving, protecting your daughter, with nothing and no one to help you. The failure is not yours, Leo. It is mine. I told you that you would be safe here, and I failed to ensure it." Leo stared at him, stunned into silence by the fierce conviction in his voice. "Do you have any idea what it's like?" Julian's voice dropped, becoming ragged with an emotion Leo had never heard from him before. "To have all this?" He gestured around the vast, empty room. "All this power, all this money, and to be utterly, completely alone? For years, my life has been a series of transactions, board meetings and balance sheets. This apartment wasn't a home, it was a waiting room. I was just waiting. I didn't even know what for." His grip on Leo's arms gentled, his thumbs stroking the fabric of his shirt. His storm-gray eyes were filled with a raw, aching vulnerability. "And then you and Lily came," he whispered. "And for the first time in a decade, this place wasn't silent. There was laughter. There were crayon drawings on my desk. There was someone who knew how to make coffee. My life, which I had curated into a state of perfect, sterile control, was suddenly beautifully messy. And I realized what I had been waiting for." He looked directly into Leo's eyes, and the world seemed to shrink to the space between them. "I wasn't protecting you out of some sense of duty, Leo. I was protecting you because the thought of my life going back to the way it was before, the silence, is more terrifying than anything Mark could ever do." He let go of one of Leo's arms and raised a hand to his face, his fingers gently tracing the line of his jaw. The touch was electric, a spark in the supercharged air. "I am not pretending," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not at the gala, not at the auction, not now. I have not felt this real in my entire life." Leo's breath hitched. Tears he hadn't realized were forming welled in his eyes and spilled over, tracing hot paths down his cheeks. Julian's thumb gently wiped them away. The gesture was so tender, so intimate. It broke the last of Leo's resistance. All the fear, all the uncertainty, all the desperate, unspoken longing coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. Julian leaned in slowly, giving him every chance to pull away. But Leo didn't move. He couldn't. He leaned forward, closing the small distance between them, and met him halfway. The first touch of their lips was soft, tentative, a question asked and answered in the same breath. Then, as if a dam had broken inside them both, the kiss deepened. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of profound, soul-deep recognition. It was a kiss that tasted of desperation and relief, of loneliness and homecoming. It was full of unspoken promises, of silent confessions, of the staggering, terrifying, beautiful certainty that this was not an illusion. This was real. Leo's hands came up to grip the front of Julian's tuxedo jacket, holding on as if he were drowning. Julian's arms wrapped around him, pulling him flush against his body, holding him with a fierce, protective strength that felt like the safest place on earth. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. They rested their foreheads together, the city lights a distant, blurry backdrop to the new world that had just been born between them. "Stay," Julian whispered, his voice rough. "Stay with me, Leo. Both of you." "Okay," Leo breathed, the word a promise and a prayer. "Okay." In the calm, sober light of the next morning, the world felt both irrevocably changed and strangely peaceful. The emotional storm of the previous night had passed, leaving behind a quiet clarity. They moved around each other in the kitchen with a new, unspoken understanding, their hands brushing as they reached for the milk, their eyes meeting over the rim of their coffee cups in a way that spoke volumes. The first order of business was neutralizing the threat. Julian was a man of his word. While Leo made Lily her requested happy face pancakes, Julian was in his office, his voice a low, decisive hum on the phone. He wasn't just a man with resources. He was a man who knew precisely how to deploy them. By noon, it was over. Graves arrived at the penthouse, his expression calm and professional. He reported that Mark had been apprehended. He hadn't been hiding in some shadowy corner of the city, but in a cheap motel room registered under his own name, paid for in cash. His grand plan had been fueled by desperation and delusion, not cunning. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The threatening texts, the phone call to the penthouse, a history of harassment that Julian's legal team had meticulously compiled from Leo's old police reports and statements from former neighbors. A restraining order was being expedited, and criminal charges for stalking and making threats were being filed. "He will not be able to contact you, or come near you or your daughter, for a very long time," Graves concluded. "If ever again." The relief that washed over Leo was so immense, it made him feel lightheaded. He sank onto the sofa, the tension that had been a constant companion for years, finally unspooling from his spine. It was over. Truly, finally over. With the external threat removed, the primary reason for their cohabitation was technically gone. The fortress was no longer needed. A new, more terrifying uncertainty took its place. What now? Later that afternoon, after Lily had been read a story and had drifted off for a nap, a quiet sobriety settled over the apartment. Leo stood by the windows, looking down at the city, the same view Julian had stared at the night before. He could return to his life now. He could go back to his tiny apartment, his catering job, his daily struggle. The thought, which should have felt like a return to freedom, felt like a devastating loss. Julian came to stand beside him. He didn't touch him, just stood there, a solid presence at his side, following his gaze. "You're free to go, of course," Julian said softly, his voice carefully neutral. "You and Lily are safe now. I can have Arthur drive you back whenever you're ready." The words were a test. A necessary, painful offering of an exit. Leo turned to face him. He looked at this powerful, complicated man who had confessed his own profound loneliness. He thought of the crayon drawing of the three of them, of the gentle way he tucked Lily into bed, of the taste of his kiss. "Is that what you want?" Leo asked, his voice steady. Julian's composure finally fractured. A flicker of raw fear crossed his face. "No," he said, the word wrenched from him. "It's the last thing I want." He took a step closer, his hands finding Leo's. "I want you to stay, but I want you to stay because you choose to, not because you feel trapped or grateful or indebted to me. I don't want to be your protector anymore, Leo. I want to be your partner." The word hung in the air between them. Partner. It was a word of equality, of choice, of a shared future. "There are things we need to figure out," Julian continued, his voice earnest. "The press, for one, and your job. It wouldn't be appropriate for you to continue working for a company that contracts with mine. It would create a power imbalance I have no interest in. I've already spoken to my board this morning. I've started the process of restructuring my holdings, creating a blind trust. I'm stepping back from the day-to-day operations. It's something I've wanted to do for a while, but I never had a reason. Now I do." Leo stared at him, dumbfounded. Julian Vance was reordering his entire empire, sacrificing a measure of his legendary control, not for a business deal, but for him. For them. To ensure they could start on equal footing. "Julian," Leo whispered, overwhelmed. "I don't want to buy your life, Leo," Julian said fiercely, his grip on Leo's hands tightening. "I want to share it. I want to wake up and make coffee with you. I want to be there for Lily's school plays. I want to argue about what to watch on television. I want a messy, complicated, real life. With you." Tears welled in Leo's eyes again, but this time they were not tears of fear or sadness. They were tears of a profound, earth-shattering joy. He had spent so long just trying to survive that he had forgotten what it felt like to be truly wanted, to be chosen. He raised a hand to Julian's face, his palm resting against the sharp line of his jaw. "I choose this," Leo said, his voice thick with emotion. "I choose you." The relief that flooded Julian's face was a beautiful thing to behold. He closed his eyes, leaning into Leo's touch, as if it were the only solid thing in the world. And then he smiled, a real, unguarded smile that lit up his entire being. He pulled Leo into a hug, burying his face in his shoulder. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice muffled. "There's just one problem," Leo said, a playful note entering his tone for the first time. Julian pulled back, his expression immediately concerned. "What is it?" "This apartment," Leo said, gesturing around the vast, minimalist space. "It's beautiful, but it's not a home. It's your fortress. And we don't need a fortress anymore." Julian's smile returned, wider this time. "Then we'll find a home," he said simply. "Together." 6 months later, the autumn sun cast long golden shadows across the park. The air was crisp, smelling of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. Lily's laughter, bright and clear as a bell, echoed as she ran across the grass, her red coat a vibrant splash of color against the green. She was chasing a kite, its long rainbow tail dancing wildly in the breeze. Holding the other end of the string was Julian. He was laughing too, a deep, easy sound that Leo had come to cherish. He had his sleeves rolled up, his tie was gone, and there was a streak of mud on his cheek where he had stumbled while helping Lily launch the kite. He looked younger, happier, and more relaxed than Leo had ever seen him. Leo sat on a nearby bench, a thermos of hot chocolate beside him, simply watching them. They weren't in Julian's sterile penthouse or Leo's cramped apartment. They were here, in a public park near the new house they had bought together. A house with a small, messy garden, too many bookshelves, and walls covered in framed crayon drawings. A home. Julian had kept his promise. He had stepped back from his company, handing the reins to a trusted successor and taking on a more strategic advisory role. He now had time. Time for morning pancakes, for afternoon kite flying, for reading bedtime stories in a funny voice that made Lily giggle uncontrollably. He had become Jules to her, a beloved playmate and a steady, comforting presence. And to Leo, he had become everything. Their life wasn't a fairy tale. It was real. They had small disagreements about where to hang pictures and who had forgotten to buy milk. They had nights where they were both too tired to speak. But through it all, there was a deep, abiding sense of peace and partnership. Leo had found his safe harbor, and Julian had found his home. Julian, sensing his gaze, looked over and smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He said something to Lily, who nodded enthusiastically, and then he began to reel the kite in. He walked over to the bench and sat down beside Leo, their shoulders and hips pressing together comfortably. "Getting cold?" Julian asked, wrapping an arm around him and pulling him closer. "No," Leo said, leaning his head on Julian's shoulder. "I'm perfect." He watched Lily as she carefully began to wind the kite's string around its holder, her small face a mask of concentration. "She's so happy." "We all are," Julian said quietly. He pressed a soft kiss to Leo's hair. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their daughter, a perfect little family unit against the backdrop of the setting sun. Leo shifted, turning to look up at him. He traced the faint smile on Julian's lips with his finger. "You know," he said, his voice soft, "sometimes it still feels like I'm dreaming, like I'm just pretending to be the man who gets to have all this." Julian caught his hand, bringing his fingers to his lips for a gentle kiss. He looked deep into Leo's eyes, his own gaze full of a love so profound it still sometimes took Leo's breath away. "Leo," he said, his voice a low, intimate murmur that was for him alone. "I was never pretending." He leaned in, and his lips met Leo's in a kiss that was gentle and sure, a quiet reaffirmation of a promise made and a future chosen. It tasted of cool autumn air, faint sweetness from the hot chocolate, and the simple, extraordinary feeling of being home.